It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 5 years has shared with us her extensive research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is Dialogue Conspiracy number 241. It's November 1st, 1976. A beautiful day in Carmel. And I have a guest with me here today. Her name is Lydia Blades, and she's an authority on many, many subjects. We met through Dialogue Conspiracy, and Lydia's going to share her research and information on the Romanovs and the Russian Revolution. I've done many shows on the story from Dallas to Watergate. This is from the Romanovs to Watergate. Before we get into the show, Lydia, you have so much to offer. Lydia lives in Salinas. As I said, we met through this program and have shared a lot of research and hours on the telephone through the last couple of years. I just want to read one quotation here. It was from the Berkeley Barb this week. It's from an article by Paul Krasner. And he's talking about a book. This is a quotation from a book it's by Kenneth Boulding, called Knowledge in Life and Society. The Image, Knowledge in Life and Society by Kenneth Boulding. And this is what he wrote. This is one sentence from the book. To a very large extent, change in the image comes about through the impact on society of usually creative, charismatic, or prophetic individuals. These individuals represent, if we like, mutations of the image. They do not follow in the footsteps of their parents. They question the sanctity of the transcript, and they defy the sanctions of both their superiors and their peer group. This is appropriate, I think, to the lifestyle of Lydia and myself and others who have questioned our peer group and our superiors and have broken through some of the facades around us. And my moment of awareness, I guess, began when John Kennedy was killed. But I just noticed in the news this week, I brought in a few articles of the images that are being destroyed in our daily papers every day, and this is just this week's news. And one of those articles, we're going to spend the rest of the program on at length in particular. But there's an article here, the FBI agent's warning of Pearl Harbor attack is told. There's a University of Hawaii has an oral history project, and a person, Governor John Burns in Hawaii, made a record for the oral history telling how the FBI had told him that Pearl Harbor would be attacked, and they knew in advance, and nobody shied away from it, and that he was ashamed to say anything at the hearings about Pearl Harbor, about what happened, even though he knew that everyone knew in advance that Japan was going to bomb Pearl Harbor. Another article this week, U.S. pilot's body kept frozen 13 years according to Cubans, and it has to do in Denver, Colorado, with a spy plane, the U-2, that was flown over the Gulf of Mexico 2 days before John Kennedy was killed. And this body is still kept in ice, and it reminds me of the stories of the body of Howard Hughes that was not seen from the time of the Boston Hospital in 1966. Nobody knows where he was, and there's been talk of freezing people, and a U-2 plane did go down at that time, and a body was not recovered according to the records. So the federal government has been keeping a frozen body, and I have heard of other cases that they have. Again, it was in Colorado and Wyoming. There was a TV show last week on Amelia Earhart. The story revives a controversy, and it talks about this famous woman flyer who, in quotes, probably lost her life just north of the equator. It was a big hoax. Whatever the story was, it wasn't the real story. We were never told the real story. She had a contract marriage to a public relations man in 1937, and the story of Amelia Earhart has not been told. Also in the news this week is a new book by a good investigator, Anthony Scadato, on the new Lindbergh theory. He has a book on Lindbergh that he says that Hauptmann was the scapegoat, not much different than Lee Harvey Oswald and the other famous patsies we've been studying about in history, that Hauptmann did not kidnap the Lindbergh baby. And there's even been studies that that baby is now a grown man, and that the organized crime had worked this out and did, in fact, live and wasn't killed. Scadato has been on a lot of government images and hoaxes for a long time. He's an investigative journalist for the New York Post who wrote a book on Marilyn Monroe. He wrote one on Bob Dylan and one on the Rolling Stones and now one on the Charles Lindbergh case. So this, Lydia, sort of applies to what we're doing. If one writer catches the kernel of truth in one case, say whether it's a Marilyn Monroe murder, you can take it on, say, to the exploitation of the Rolling Stones and their performances in the killing at Altamont, or you can expose certain theories or the cover story behind the Bob Dylan story. He's into something. Now he's onto the Lindbergh case. These are all big promotional deals, and he's into it. And then the last article, the biggest hoax of all that Lydia and I are going to talk about today, was the one that I knew that she was the expert on. This is her expertise, and it combines with my work, and it's a new book out, articles from the Associated Press, Wire story this week. It's a book on the Tsar's family, and it's called The File on the Tsar, written by Anthony Summers and Tom Mangold. And it says that it brings up questions that we'll go into here. I'll bring them out. And the allegations that the Tsar's wife and 4 daughters did not live, and none of them were shot down like the original historic account. And I called Lydia when I saw this because she's done extensive work on that subject, and I have done work into the John Kennedy area of Marina Oswald, believing that she was related to the Tsar's family and that the white Russian community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area was the key to the whole historic assassination story. That's why I spent 8 years cross-filing every single word, because to me that was more fascinating than even the guns and the bullets and the trajectories, was that white Russian link and the motivations and the mechanics between the Kennedy assassination. So Lydia, should we talk a little bit about this book that came out, their allegations first, and then you correct them, or do you want to do something first?
Well, I would very much like to say thank you to Daniel Shore. Mae, for years and years and years, you probably knew, and I certainly knew, that the Pandora's Box was the Mary Carter Paint Company. And I knew that out of that came many evils. But I never could find one piece of information about it, and that was who was the original founder of that paint company. I looked and looked probably for 10 years. And the only place that I've ever seen the answer was in the Pike report that Daniel Shore leaked.
Do you think that's why he was fired for 2 years?
Oh, absolutely. I think that news was never intended to come out. The original founders were Allen Dulles and Tom Dewey. And as soon as I knew that, and it was thanks to Daniel Shore, I knew it galvanized my thinking that I didn't want to think.
Well, this is the way my research is done. I have a certain given set of facts, like 10 or 12, and then I have 5 or 6 that relate to it. And then that connecting joint, like the joints in our body or the discs in our spine, it meets and connects. This is, the way the Howard Hughes story has been put together, my Kennedy assassination. And the Mary Carter, of course, Allen Dulles formed that, Shore released that, and the CIA was behind Dewey. But a lot of people don't realize that Earl Warren was put up for vice president by the Mary Carter Paint Company, and then he headed the Warren Commission. And again, it goes into our Romanoff and Marina Oswald that we'll get into today. Try hopefully to get all these links in, because you see, she was the very first witness at the Warren Commission, and Earl Warren said, "Well, come on in, darling. Are you comfortable? Is everything all right? How do the children have a seat?" He treated her like an empress, instead of going on with the ballistics. Marina was very important. And Earl Warren was selected by the intelligence community and the Mary Carter Paint Company to be the vice president, certainly probably the president.
Well, I find, Mae, that I am unable to live in an illogical world. I cannot be constantly struck by ugly things like, in the middle of a peace conference, here comes a U-2 plane hurtling down over Sverdlovsk. Or
and who brought the U-2 down? Gary Powers said, Lee Harvey Oswald, in Minsk with Marina again. These things, yeah.
Or Japan takes over Manchuria.
For no reason.
Who pays attention? Certainly not the League of Nations, because the next day Lindbergh's baby is kidnapped, and everybody is sure that that is much more important.
Well, you were the person that called attention to the shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand within hours of when Rasputin was killed.
Almost at precisely the same moment.
in
The
history.
same moment that the very serious assassination attempt took place on Rasputin.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
And he could have prevented the World War I.
Yes, had he been able to get up and return to Moscow, he would have. They feel that he would have been able to prevent Nicholas from having Russia enter the war. Then you have all these assassinations and kidnappings, and either life is an illogical process, or else I cannot perceive of it as a logical process, but I'm sure that there are reasons for all of these things. I don't think anybody goes out and does a kidnapping of, say, Patty Hearst or the Lindbergh baby or rushes off into Manchuria without a reason.
No, well, you know.
But we do not know the reasons.
But if you pursue it, Lydia, like the things that you've pursued, and there's so many, the listening audience will maybe have a lot of opportunity to hear some of the things you've done. You take a case like Alger Hiss, and I pursued that. This pumpkin story, of Halloween pulling some film out of a field is just totally illogical. I can't live with that either.
Not the best storage place for
And
film.
then, no, not the best on a fall evening, even before daylight savings. But I went, further into the pursuits and discovered that when Alger Hiss was in the Senate, he was the only person in the 30s that went there with a book called The Merchants of Death.
Oh, yes.
And he was the only congressional, he was a lawyer for the Senate investigating certain things, helping them with investigations. And he was the only gentleman that brought the DuPonts and Mellons to Congress to testify. And that was disgraceful because he charged them with illegally rearming Germany after World War I. And
Hiss did that?
Alger Hiss. And at that time, Whittaker Chambers was introduced to him at that time period during those congressional hearings under a different name.
Yes.
And then they sent Alger Hiss to Dumbarton Oaks, and Allen Dulles put him on the Carnegie Foundation, and they sent him to Yalta. Then when the war was over, they disgraced Hiss by identifying. They brought in then, well, here's Roosevelt, here's the UN, he was in on the UN Charter, here's the Yalta. We came all identified with communist Hiss, and out comes Whittaker Chambers, whose credentials were from Time magazine, and with Allen Dulles and that team, to bring down Alger Hiss and get him in jail. And it was like a time bomb, and I don't think for a minute, none of that was coincidental.
Oh,
they
no.
just used
no.
him like a smelly piece of fish and just pulled him out when the time was ready.
Well, one of the things that I began to wonder about, it came to the point where I had to make sense out of some of these things, just had to. And one of the things I wondered about in the beginning was, why is it always Russia that they're after? Why is it always Russia? There are other atheists in the world. The Buddhists don't believe in a supreme being. We're not always gung-ho to liquidate the Buddhists.
That's right.
China is just as communistic.
And they're breeding twice as fast and more arms. That's right. They were let off the atomic bomb. Yeah, that's right.
So why Russia? And eventually I came to the point where I thought, someone who has a lot of money, enough to buy, say, a head of the CIA,
Or the Dulles brothers.
a spy here and a spy there,
And the whole agency, if you own Allen
a governor
Dulles.
here and a governor there,
Yeah.
someone who knows statecraft in and out has to be at work. There has to be someone who is desperate. For instance, the U-2. Why did that happen? Why did that happen just as a peace corps?
Eisenhower clearly said, don't fly over there for weeks. We're going to the peace conference.
And that was an act of desperation, yeah, I believe. I believe. And I began to check, and reluctantly I came to the conclusion that the Tsar wanted his throne back. And therefore he must be alive.
Well, you see the story between the John Kennedy assassination. Well, that goes back, and we'll go into this the review of this book so far, and the fact that they could be alive, and then you can tell about your research on how you felt all along they were, long before this book came out. In the case of the Kennedy assassination, all of the witnesses that created the whole profile that Oswald was a crazy or loner that worked for every other assassination were the white Russian community, with links high up into the possible, even the Tsar's family. We'll talk about Colonel Orlov and Marina, and another Orlov who may or may not be a relative with the Tsar's wife. We have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Greek Orthodox Church, setting up the chain of command for Sirhan to come to this country and his family, and being involved. And we have the Russian situation, the Cold War with the Rosenbergs, the whole Cold War, the whole rearming of this country, the political campaign. We have to be armed against Russia. Everything is Russia.
Everything is Russia.
Everything is Russia, and every one of these conspiracies has some element of that into it.
Right. I'd like to read something here, Mae, which I think throws an interesting light on this subject. And it's discussing a sect of the Russian Orthodox Church, which are known as Straniki. It means wanderers. It says, in nearly every Russian village there are simple peasants who also belong in secret to the Brotherhood of the Wanderers, and whose duty it is to give shelter to the Straniki. Their houses contain a special room, a hayloft, a closet without windows in the courtyard, or cellar, where wanderers in need of protection and rest are lodged. Sometimes whole villages are in sympathy with the Straniki, and then practically every house has an underground lodging in readiness for them. When the wanderer feels that the time of his roaming is at an end, he sometimes gains a reputation for special sanctity. He becomes a wise man.
Sounds like the CIA safe house.
Or a starets.
Yeah.
And this, of course, was what Rasputin belonged to. And he was a starets. Now, I think that it was by means
Of the
Straniki
that they were housed.
that the Tsar and his family were able to escape.
Remember
Plus other outside help.
Remember the name Sirhan Bashar. Sirhan means the wanderer. They gave him that name when they left, and he left, Palestine and came to this country through the Greek Orthodox Church, and he was known as the wanderer. That was a nickname. Just coincidentally, again.
Well, doesn't the name Sirhan itself
Yeah.
mean wanderer?
Sirhan.
Yeah. And of course the
he
Greek,
was a double wanderer. He got pretty far, too.
the wanderer who wanders. Well, isn't the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, these are in fact
Well,
one
they were
church?
one. I'm talking about one.
Yes.
Yeah, the Russian Greek. Yeah, the Russian. This book that just came out. We don't have it yet, but I do have some notes from it. There were several articles in the paper, and I want to tell about it. And then maybe you can tell from your experience, because where they leave off with probablys or they don't know, you've done more work than they have, and maybe you get in touch with them. But we could just run down on the air for the listeners who are not familiar with the book that we're talking about. This one is called The File on the Tsar. It just came out. And it has to do with the murder of the Tsars, Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, Grand Duchess Maria, Duchess Tatiana. Is that pronounced right?
As far as I know.
Duchess Olga, Grand Duchess Anastasia, and Grand Duke Alexis, their one son. And the original story for young people, a lot of this listening audience are young, and the history is very jaded and faded. I don't even know if they remember. The original story was that they were all taken down to a room. Was it a cellar? And shot.
A basement room.
And it was flooded with blood. It was the cruelest thing, and the bodies were spread all over. We have this visual image because it was portrayed many times on film and other things, the terrible Bolsheviks, this nice family, and these darling children with all their curls, ribbons, just pools of blood. Wasn't that quite forceful, that image? I remember.
Yes, it was very well presented.
But it was star stresses.
Yeah, it was
thing.
presented by Sokolov, largely, who was paid $5,000 by the mother of Tsar Nicholas.
Well, yeah, his name
to write it.
His name comes out in the book. Judge Sokolov turns out to be the Earl Warren of this story. He takes over. He is the Earl Warren. This book goes on. It says the new sources of research upon which this book is based are original affidavits and police reports from Russian teletype, and they're located in the vaults of the Houghton Library at Harvard University and also out at Stanford. Now, this is funny. I'll bring this up in a minute. I don't want to digress too far from the book on why they leave these records of their police work and do something different. We could do a whole show on that. I don't understand that, But anyway, these actual court records do exist now, and these people from England, British Broadcasting, spent 5 years writing the book, and they used German, British, American archives and went through all the evidence they could of books in America and Harvard and Stanford Hoover Library, and found absolutely no evidence that the murder took place in the cellar as it was told. This article went on to say the authors agree that Lennon, now here are the probablys, Lydia, this is where you come in as a historian, and we were talking about this earlier, and the response you gave is like what I do every time I hear a wrong story about Lee Harvey Oswald, like he was smoking cigarettes with Castro or something. I get so mad at the wrong version because I know where he was at that time. These are the probablys. The authors agree that Lennon probably made a decision to have the Tsar and his young son executed at the accepted date. Do you think that the Tsar was executed and the son or not?
No, I do not. And I sort of laugh at this. In the first place, my research would indicate that the king, George V, and the Kaiser, Wilhelm, collaborated. Even though it was during World War I, they collaborated in the rescue of the Tsar. And Lenin really didn't have much to say about it at all. He was one, I believe, you see, that they arranged a prisoner of war exchange, so to speak, in which Lenin was exchanged for the Tsar's family.
Lenin could have the throne if the Tsar got out.
Yeah, they hand us the body of Lenin, hand us the body of the
They traded
royal
heads
family.
of state.
That's correct. That's what I think
Okay.
happened.
Well, see, the book,
And if you notice the dates, within 3 days of the time that the Tsar and his family were taken prisoner, Lenin was given the go-ahead to go back to Russia.
To go back to
within 3 days.
well, okay, here's their second probably. They agree that the Tsarina and her 4 daughters were secretly moved to Perm, 200 miles northeast of Ekaterinburg. I can't pronounce it. Ekaterinburg, with the Bolsheviks, hoping to exchange them for prominent revolutionaries imprisoned in Germany. Do you believe there was a deal made to move them separately, or do you think they all went together?
No, I think they were broken up at various times, but when they got out of Ekaterinburg, I believe they were together. Now, I think that you will not find the truth out of the BBC or out of England.
Yeah.
Because King George and the royal family, having been instrumental in securing their release, and I believe that the Romanovs lived in Ceylon, were taken there on a British man of war, and sheltered by the British for several years. Now, you're not going to get an admission of that sort out of the BBC in England at this time.
Now, what you get is out of the British government. As soon as Hitler was defeated and Allen Dulles realized that Hitler couldn't get back into Germany, into Russia, and win that angle, the British intelligence combined immediately with American intelligence in the Rockefeller building. A man called Intrepid tells about it, and in the Bahamas. So naturally, they're not going to tell the whole story because they're getting ready to get back to Russia now. As a matter of fact, we're talking, it's the day before the elections, and people get this tape, the election will be over. But the whole thing of Jimmy Carter's campaign has to do with Przewkin and Schlesinger getting back to Russia. This isn't an academic thing. If people think for any minute it's academic, they're dying to get back on that Russian soil, and there are many people very concerned that if Carter were elected, they'd be there in 6 months.
Well, many people think, monarchy is a thing of the past.
Oh.
But it isn't in Spain.
Or America.
And you know that there is an entire organization, which I think came out of the Knights of Malta, and has been variously known by names such as the Holy Band, the Secret Circle, the Heckenschützes, and so on. Which is formed and operates for the sole purpose of restoring monarchy.
Yeah. Well, look how close we came with Nixon with the band and the costumes and Haldeman. I mean, we were almost there. His daughters, they tried.
But the casting was poor.
The casting was poor. But poor Tricia tried to get Prince Charles. I mean, they tried every way. Remember that? The yacht, the lights out, and everything. Well, let's get back to this book. We're talking about a new book on the Soviet Union and the fact that the Tsar and his family were not murdered, and then it began the Cold War policy, which has affected our era, I think, with Algerhiss and the Rosenbergs and the Kennedys, all these killings and the McCarthy hearings and so forth. This book alleges, this is another sentence you won't like, but then you can explain it. Lenin probably, the authors do say probably, they know that the Tsar's wives, the Tsarina, and the 4 girls lived, and they're courteous enough to put a probably. The Warren Report was filled with probablys too. He said Lenin probably made the decision to barter the German-born Tsarina and her 4 daughters for German goodwill. Negotiating with the Kaiser, Lenin may have promoted the notion among his followers that the family were dead, thus making it easier to move them in the turbulent conditions of the Civil War and avoid the anger of militant Bolsheviks who wanted them liquidated. Do you think Lenin...
Well, politics is the art of the possible. Now, if you look back, I'm not on anybody's side.
Yeah.
Probably if I
have
had
that
been
in common.
I had been filled with the kind of propaganda that the Tsar and his family, that Russia is mine by divine right, I probably would have lapped it up too.
Uh-huh.
So I don't blame the Tsar as a person or Lenin as a person or any of these things. So long as people try to do their best, I try to overlook things. But if the Tsar and his family were alive, and had been alive all these years, and people had been taking money for promoting that cause, they surely wouldn't want the news to be known.
No, what'd you say, they had 88 billion when they left? How much did they take with them?
33 billion.
33
billion with B as in butter.
Yeah, bees.
All right. Now, if the communists had been negotiating this prisoner of war exchange, then they would have been dealing with the devil. Surely they didn't want it known. The royal family of England surely doesn't want it known that they helped in this at all. Certainly, there is, and the bankers who are holding the Tsar's money certainly don't want anybody to turn up and claim that money.
Well, why wouldn't the regime, like Lenin and that group, just keep that 33 billion? Didn't they need that money to reconstruct the country?
Well, a lot of it they did get. The real estate holdings, the palaces, the gold mines, and so on, of course, remained in Russia. But before the war and during the early part of the war, the Tsar had sent money to Berlin, to New York,
Oh,
Chase
really?
National Bank, the Bank of England, any amount of money. Just uncountable amounts of money.
Before the war.
Oil stocks, the Pennsylvania Railroad. And now I'm back in a full circle. When you said, if you once get a handle on any one of these incidents, it overlaps.
Yeah.
With all the Tsar's money and everything, can the Pennsylvania Railroad possibly go broke?
Never. No. Never. How does the Pennsylvania...
I mean, it would take good management to get it bankrupt.
Do they control even that? Do you think they control even that?
I don't know whether they control it, but certainly there was a large amount of money went out of the Tsar's personal pocket into the Pennsylvania Railroad. And oil.
And oil. Yeah.
And oil.
Well, the court case, this book goes in that Judge Ivan how do you pronounce his name? Sergeyev? Spent 6 months, according to these authors, gathering information for the White Russians that concerned them and what happened to their Tsar and the royal family. And he concluded, this judge, he said, I don't believe that all the people, the Tsar, his family, and those with him, were shot. And then Judge Sergeyev was immediately dismissed. It's like Judge Carter in the Patty Hearst case, or Judge Battle at James Earl Ray. In January 1919, he was replaced by Nikolai Sokolov. And that's a gentleman
with his $5,000.
Yeah, $5,000 wasn't much when you're talking about 33 billion.
In those days, it was.
It was, but he was paid by the Tsarina's mother. It was her mother.
By the Tsar's mother. Yeah, Marie Fedorovna.
Oh, and then the story turned around, and Sokolov gave the mass murder story that began the terrible anti-Russian propaganda that stayed ever since it was his version of history, this book says, that became the definitive version.
Yes.
It's like the Warren Report being the definitive version according to Earl Warren, for 75 years. Why he sets a time limit on it, I don't know, but for 75 years, and these two authors have spent a lot of time. There's one question they had in their book, maybe you know it. They wondered if Lenin kept the family alive as hostages for a deal with the Germans. The authors seem to think that the motive evaporated because when Germany was defeated, the Kaiser was out anyway.
Well, at the moment when the Tsar's escape took place, and this took some time, incidentally, and Lenin didn't gain power until after he got back into Russia. At the moment the prisoner of war exchange was arranged, as I believe it was, Lenin didn't really have a whole lot to say about it.
He didn't?
Not until he got back into Russia. He had to agree to it because he had to go through Germany in a sealed train.
Where was Lenin?
In Zurich, in Switzerland.
Was he?
Mm-hmm.
When all this was going on?
He was in exile.
So I wasn't even familiar with that.
I'd like to sort of give my version of
Okay.
what I think happened.
Yeah, that's what
You
I
go
think you
ahead
should
with
know.
that.
Do give your version of what you think happened to the Tsar and the Tsar's family, and then maybe we'll jump to Dallas and go a little bit into the Kennedy thing. And
Yes, because
Marie
I
Oswald.
Yes, these
Okay.
things overlap, I'm sure. I think that the Russian aristocracy, a large part of it, moved into Manchuria with the thought of setting up a white Russian government there and regaining control of Russia. And that this is one of the reasons why the Japanese went into Manchuria, and one of the reasons why nobody particularly objected
To going in.
to the Japanese going into Manchuria. I think it was a case of either the White Russians taking over Manchuria or the Japanese taking over Manchuria. Now, after that fell through, then I think they decided that Germany was the logical way to regain the Tsar's throne.
So they put Hitler up for it to do it for them.
And you know, all sorts of small little facts fit here. For instance, I didn't know this until relatively recently, but the Tsarina used to have as her personal emblem the swastika. And of course, then you find Hitler.
Do you think it's possible that the people, say, who lost their property, the cousins and the aunts and uncles, or say, in the case of George DeMohrenschildt, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA babysitter, so to speak, his father ran the Nobel oil fields in Russia. Do you think that they just naturally would want their wealth and power, even though his father's dead? Do you have to be alive to go back to grab what you got? I mean, does it matter? Would it matter if the Tsar was dead or alive? Wouldn't they still want to avenge if they had a piece of the action? As long as they had an investment over there and they felt that the Russians took it.
Well, they need a rallying point. They've either got to have the Tsar or one of the Grand Dukes or the Tsarevich. They might get by with one of the daughters, but they need a point around which to rally.
Well, take the anti-Castro-Cubans. They all rally around the fact that they can run the gaming tables like Frank Sturgis and be part of the mafia, be in the big money instead of running a real estate office in Miami or whatever, or selling aluminum doors. The rallying point is money. If they coax the government to go back and invade their homeland with their assistance, they get some status over there. They're big shots where they're nothing here, but
Yes, but in order to persuade the peasants to fight,
you've got to offer them something.
you've got to have a banner. You've got to have a banner.
But
you see.
enough
And defend the little father.
did enough peasants ever dream that the Romanovs were alive?
No, but they had only to reveal that fact in order to rouse a lot of, that is to say, soon after he lost his throne. Now, if they reveal that fact, probably there'd be a rush on to strangle the Tsar, you know. But in the beginning, they could, the Russians were very patriotic.
I think
Very patriotic toward the Tsar and his family,
But,
despite the
yeah.
fact that he did nothing to deserve it.
Don't you think that bloody death would cause them, say, to avenge it just as much as if the people alive, or you think they're being alive, they could dish out the money to fire their anger? They took the $33 billion and they could
You've got
pay
to
it
have
out.
some propaganda, and
Yes.
somebody has to pay for
Somebody
that.
has to pay for it, so that they can get their vengeance by handing out this money to the intelligence communities wherever they are, whatever form they take.
Well, in order, you see, it became obvious, I think, that the Tsar by himself and his exile community could not regain his throne. So they were looking around for likely possibilities. Who could they persuade to fight?
So they could get Germany to come back and take it for
so
them.
Germany was selected.
Yeah, you brought a book today that has a statement that if Hitler did conquer Russia, he was going to put the ruling class, he wouldn't run it, but the Tsar's family would run it.
Yes, the Romanovs would have gone back on their throne had
Hitler won the war.
Had Hitler won the war.
That's so fascinating because people don't think about reinstating the Romanovs. They just think, well, they're gone. That Hitler would run it like he did Poland or France. And do you think that half of this genealogical thing that the Mormons have or the Jews have is to separate the blue bloods from the others so they know which are the ruling class when it comes time to reconquer in China and Russia? There's so much emphasis on this genealogy of going back. There's a quotation here in the Warren Report, Warren Commission hearings, where George DeMohrenschildt was called by Albert Jenner as a witness before the Warren Commission. This is Volume 9. And we could go into his background. DeMohrenschildt's background is fascinating. And they asked him, how is it that you came to visit Marina Oswald one day and went down to visit her in Fort Worth? And he said, well, she's pretty and she comes from an excellent family. And she was very high up in the Soviet Union, and he knew her family. He knew who her family was from Minsk. She comes from an excellent family. And, what's your best recollection? And he said he knew about her family. And also her friend Gally Clark, that provided her with food and clothing when Lee was in Dallas and Marina was in Fort Worth. George DeMohrenschildt said, well, she was born in France of upper society. In Russia, she was born Princess Sherbatov. Their families are better than the Cabots and lodges here in the States. And they keep throwing these names around of these higher-ups, that they knew their status there. Well, those names would be lost, just Marina Oswald or whatever, taking on these other names. And it seems to me that this genealogy would be wonderful for them to reconstruct later.
Well, didn't the DeMohrenschildts come via Manchuria?
Yes.
Yes. Well,
they came through the Manchurian Railroad, and you were going to talk about, this is the testimony of Jean DeMohrenschildt in Volume 9, page 286. And they asked her about coming to this country, and she said, my father, we were born in Russia. My father was in charge of the Far Eastern Railroad, and he sold it in 1925. The Chinese people sold the railroad to the Russians, but her father worked there, and he was very prosperous on that Far Eastern Railroad. And then she went into Manchuria and then left the Chinese Eastland Railroad. He was the director.
I'd like to ask a favor of people listening. There have been books written about many facets of this problem, but very, very few were ever written about the Russian exile community during its time in Manchuria.
Uh-huh.
And I feel sure that there must be people listening who actually came that route and who do know what happened. In particular, I would like to know whether or not the famous Casbah kidnapping I would like to know anything people know about that, because I have a very good reason to believe that was directly concerned with Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was a man who has been vastly overlooked, and he was Rasputin's first secretary. His name was Aaron Simonovich. He was a jeweler, a card sharp, and a very fine politician, a very clever politician, perhaps I should say. I would like to know if there's any relationship between the Casbahs in Harbin and Simonovich.
Mm-hmm.
I think that man should have a book or two all by himself.
Well, we talk about names that are coincidental and maybe they're common or not, but we were talking this week about when the same George DeMohrenschildt, whose father ran the Nobel oil fields, and he describes himself as being working right under the Tsar, his family, a very noble family, long list of credentials. And when he went to call on Marina Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the first time he went to see her, he went with Lawrence Orloff, and DeMohrenschildt said he has a Russian name for some reason. Maybe his great-grandfather came from Russia. He knows darn well Lawrence Orloff. And they went to visit. And you were mentioning that there was this Colonel Orloff in Russia, in the Tsar's regime, that impregnated the Tsarina when she couldn't have a son, when the Tsar had 4 daughters and didn't have a son. And it's interesting, this George DeMohrenschildt brings Colonel Lawrence Orloff to meet Marina Oswald. And he said, I went to see her because she came from Minsk, and Minsk was my home. So he worked for the Tsar, and here is this Orloff name that's so close to the Tsarina that she's actually in bed making a child for the Tsar with his full permission. And here's this Orloff with Marina Oswald, who may or may not be either his son or a cousin of some. Because I always felt through the massive amount of research of the White Russian community that she came from the very highest echelon of the Russian nobility, Marina Oswald, and that she was brought over to this country. There are documents in the National Archives. Ted Gandolfo has one that Lee Harvey Oswald was sent to the Soviet Union for the purpose of marrying and bringing this woman over. Well, when you read of contract marriages in 1937, Amelia Earhart, it's not hard to believe that you could bring an aristocracy over.
And Jackie Kennedy was a contract marriage with Aristotle.
And also this George DeMohrenschildt was a close friend of the Kennedys and saw Jackie when she was young, went right to her home where she was growing up and knew her parents and so forth. There's a very tight connection here between the very high ruling class, the Russian community, the names interweaving, the way Marina Oswald got to this country. She had no time at the American embassy or anything. She had no interviews or anything. She just, her papers, they said they gave her a hard time, which in the Soviet Union is practically impossible to come, and that she was just, it was a matter of saying, I want her to come, and she came. And the thing is that she must have been in exchange too, like a Lenin Tsarina kind of thing. She was in exchange for somebody in this country, you know.
Well,
she got out.
Her uncle is, I think, with the KGB, but people don't understand that a great many of the Tsar's secret police managed to infiltrate.
That's right. And Alan Dulles I have a memo where he was arranging to bring her co-workers from the Minsk radio factory to Argentina. And they don't bring many KGB people over. And besides that, her real family name was never played up. That was an uncle by adoption. And I always felt that either George Bowie in the Dallas-Fort Worth area or George DeMohrenschildt was a blood relative of Marina Oswald's. And the minute she arrived and Colonel Orloff visited her, they were providing her with dental care, medical care, cribs, playpens, transportation from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, all alone. Lee wasn't present during this early part. And that she was the darling of that white Russian community. She had housing and health and everything. Oh, goodness, we have so much to cover about the Tsar because the background of the Tsar escaping or the possibility that they are Marina Oswald's relatives and the motivation between the Kennedy assassination is, we have so much that's, we got 1 minute left, Lydia. How can we even begin to cover this subject?
Well, you can't cover the whole thing.
No.
But at least you can make a start.
You make a start. The point is that each of us individually have done a tremendous amount of work into these various specialties.
Could I give my mailing address so that if anyone does have information about the Manchurian episode, they might send it to me. It's Post Office Box 922 in Salinas, California.
There's a white Russian community here in Carmel at the Monterey Institute and, of course, at the DLI. And maybe by chance, most of them are older generation, and this is a pretty young listening audience, but once in a while we do get people that turn, others on that would know about these things. But I recommend you read this book about the Romanovs because it's one more hoax, this book that came out, and it's just one more story, and every day these new stories are coming out. We have to get this book by Anthony Scodato on the Lindbergh case and Hauptmann, and keep reading and watching shows like the one of Amelia Earhart, and then begin to add up, I guess, over this last era, how many events, how many hoaxes, how many major news stories said one thing, and then they switch judges or reporters, and then the whole story changes. It happened in Russia, and it's still happening.
Oh, yes. And until we get some of these things straightened out, we are never going to be able to count on tomorrow.
That's true. Well, listen, thanks a million for coming in. We'll
Thank
do it
you
again.
for having me, Mae.
It's Lydia Blades and Mae Brussell and Carmel, and we'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for many years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.